Somewhere in the hedgerows of Normandy, July 1944. A German infantry squad is advancing across an open field toward an American position. 8 men, moving in the low crouch of soldiers who have done this before, who know the drill, who trust that the mathematics of the situation favor them. They have bolt-action rifles. One man has a machine gun. They have cover to their left and the objective is 50 yards ahead. What they do not know is that the single American soldier behind the stone wall ahead of them has already started shooting. By the time the German squad has worked their bolts twice, 2 rounds each, 16 rounds total, the American has fired all 8 rounds and his clip heard the distinctive metallic ping of the empty clip ejecting automatically, inserted a full clip without taking his eyes off the approaching men, and fired 4 more times. The squad does not reach the wall. This is not a story about heroism. It is a story about arithmetic, about what happens when one side in a war gives its infantry a rifle that fires 3 times faster than the other side's, in the same hands, with the same training, at the same range. The arithmetic is not complicated. It is devastating. The rifle that made this possible was the M1 Garand, the semi-automatic, gas-operated, clip-fed, 30 caliber infantry weapon that General George S. Patton, a man not given to excessive praise for anything, called the greatest battle implement ever devised. And the man who built it was a French-Canadian machinist from a small farm outside Montreal who had left school at 12, swept floors in a textile mill, and spent 15 years in an armory workshop in Massachusetts designing a rifle that almost no one believed in, including the United States Army that eventually issued it to 5 million soldiers. Stay with me, because this is a story about a weapon. But it is really a story about something harder and more interesting than a weapon. It is a story about what it takes to build a revolutionary idea inside an institution that does not want one, and about the cost that the man who did it eventually paid for his trouble. To understand why the M1 Garand mattered, you need to understand what it replaced. And to understand it, you need to understand the hurdles that switch the The bolt-action rifle was the standard infantry weapon of every major military power entering the Second World War. The British had the Lee Enfield, the Germans had the Mauser Kar 98K, the Russians had the Mosin-Nagant, the Americans had the Springfield N1903. All of them operated on the same fundamental principle. After each shot, the soldier had to manually cycle the bolt, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a new round. The process took time, not a lot of time. A trained soldier with a bolt-action rifle could fire 15 aimed rounds per minute under ideal conditions. With time, a pause between each shot, a moment when the rifle was not ready to fire again. In the tactical context of 1914 to 1918, this had been an acceptable limitation. The First World War was fought primarily from fixed trenches where the pace of combat was measured in hours and days rather than seconds. A soldier in a trench had time between shots. The bolt-action rifle was adequate for that kind of war. But the theorists and planners who were thinking about what the next war might look like, the war that came to be called the Second World War, were not thinking about trench warfare. They were thinking about mobile operations, about infantry advancing across open ground, about ambushes in forests and hedgerows, about close-quarters fighting in buildings and villages where the distance between opposing soldiers was sometimes measured in feet rather than yards. In that kind of fighting, the time between shots was not an abstraction. It was the difference between killing the man in front of you and being killed by him before your bolt cycled. The solution was conceptually simple: a rifle that cycled automatically after each shot, using the energy of the fired cartridge to eject the spent case and chamber the next round, so the soldier could fire again as fast as he could squeeze the trigger. A semi-automatic rifle. The idea had existed for decades. Several designs had been tried. None had made it into mass military service because the engineering challenges were formidable. A military rifle is not a target shooting weapon. It has to work in mud, in sand, in rain, in freezing cold, in tropical heat. It has to function after being dropped, after being dragged through a ditch, after being carried for 20 miles. It has to be maintainable by an 18-year-old with minimal mechanical training using tools he can carry in his pocket. It has to be producible in the millions by a workforce that includes women who have never worked in a factory before. And it has to be accurate enough to hit a man-sized target at 500 yards under the stress of combat. Getting all of those requirements into a semi-automatic mechanism simultaneously in a design that could be mass-produced, reliably maintained, and trusted absolutely by the men whose lives depended on it, was the problem that had defeated every military firearms designer who had attempted it before 1919. It was the problem that John Cantius Garand decided to solve. John Cantius Garand was born on January 1, 1888, on a small farm in the town of Saint-Rémy, 17 miles south of Montreal, Quebec. He was French-Canadian, the son of a farming family in rural Quebec, raised speaking French, in a world that was as far from the corridors of American military procurement as it is possible to imagine. He attended school until he was 12 years old. Then he started working, sweeping floors in a textile mill in Connecticut, where his family had moved. He was 12 years old, sweeping floors in a factory full of machinery that he had never seen before, and instead of finding the machinery intimidating, he found it fascinating. That detail matters more than it might seem. The single quality that most consistently appears in accounts of Garand's life and work is this: he was constitutionally incapable of being around a mechanical problem without wanting to understand it completely and then improve it. The textile mill's machinery was not just something he swept around, it was something he studied. He spent his spare time learning how it worked. By the time he was 18, he was employed as a machinist. He became a tool and gauge maker. He took correspondence courses in technical subjects because no formal education was available to him for what he wanted to learn. He went to work at the Brown and Sharp Tool Factory in Providence, Rhode Island, one of the premier precision manufacturing companies in the United States at the time, where he encountered the leading edge of what machine tool design could achieve. Brown and Sharp in the early 20th century was operating at the intersection of two revolutions simultaneously: the precision machining revolution, the development of tools capable of holding tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch consistently at scale in a production environment, and the automobile revolution, which was creating demand for precision machined components at a volume and cost that had never been required before. The machine tool industry was reinventing itself to meet that demand, and Brown and Sharp was at the center of it. Garand absorbed all of it: the integration of design with production machinery, the discipline of designing a component not just to function correctly, but to be manufacturable correctly at scale, the understanding that a design which required skilled handwork to produce was not a good design for a world that needed things in large quantities quickly. These were the lessons Brown and Sharp taught him, and they would be present in every design decision he made for the rest of his career. After Brown and Sharp, Garand worked for a time in a shooting gallery, where he became seriously interested in firearms and target shooting. He began designing guns as a hobby. He was not trained as a firearms designer. He had no formal education in ballistics or weapons engineering. He had the skills of a precision machinist, the habits of a self-taught engineer, and the obsessive curiosity of a man who could not encounter a problem without wanting to solve it. He read about the mechanical problems the United States Army had experienced with its weapons during the First World War. He designed a light machine gun. He submitted the design in response to an Army request for bids. His design was selected by the War Department. In August 1918, John Cantius Garand, a French-Canadian machinist who had left school at 12 and taught himself everything he knew, was given a position at the United States Bureau of Standards and the task of perfecting his weapon. He finished the prototype within 18 months. By then, the war was over and the Army had lost interest. He was kept on as a consulting engineer, and in November 1919, he was assigned to the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, where he would spend the rest of his working life and where he would build the rifle that Patton called the greatest battle implement ever devised. The Springfield Armory had a history and a reputation that were not entirely consistent with each other by the time Garand arrived in 1919. The history was established in 1777 by George Washington and Henry Knox to store arms during the Revolutionary War, later the primary federal manufacturing center for small arms after the Harper's Ferry Armory was destroyed in the Civil War, the institution that had given its name to the Springfield rifle series that American soldiers carried through several conflicts. The reputation, by 1919, was more complicated. The armory had failed badly during the First World War. It had manufactured more than 265,000 Springfield M1903 rifles during the war, a substantial number in absolute terms, but nowhere near enough for the rapidly expanding Army's needs, and many of those it did produce had to be scrapped. The War Department had been warned for years that the Armory's production capabilities were obsolete. The warning had not been acted on. The result was a manufacturing institution that was living on its historical reputation while its actual capacity lagged badly behind what modern warfare required. Garand arrived with a mandate to design a new semi-automatic infantry rifle. He also arrived with a clear-eyed assessment of the institutional problems that would need to be solved simultaneously. The Armory was producing the wrong rifle, the bolt-action Springfield M1903, which was a fine weapon at the standards of 1903, but was designed to be built by skilled armorers at a deliberate pace, not mass-produced by a wartime workforce under time pressure. The production machinery was outdated. The workflow was inadequate. He started redesigning the production facilities while simultaneously designing the rifle. This is the part of Garand's story that gets left out of most accounts focused on the weapon itself, that the creation of the M1 Garand was not just a firearms design project. It was a manufacturing transformation project. The rifle is in without a Springfield armory capable of producing at scale, and creating that capability was part of Garand's job from the beginning. In 1919, he started design sketches on a new rifle. He became a United States citizen in 1920, which qualified him for civil service status with an annual salary of $3,500. That civil service status meant he forfeited any claim to royalties or private profit from his designs. Everything he invented at Springfield Armory belonged to the government. He accepted this condition without apparent complaint and got to work. The Army's requirements for the new rifle were both reasonable and contradictory. They wanted a semi-automatic design, faster firing than the bolt-action M1903. They wanted it to use as many parts as possible from the existing M1903 to simplify the transition and reduce cost. They wanted it chambered for the standard 30 caliber 30-06 cartridge, of which millions of rounds were already stockpiled. And they wanted it to serve infantry, cavalry, and tank crews alike. Three very different tactical environments with different requirements for weapon size, weight, and handling. What the Army wanted, in other words, was a revolutionary new rifle that was also not very different from the rifle it was replacing. This is the classic institutional demand placed on innovators inside large organizations. Change everything while changing nothing. Garand navigated it with the patience of a man who understood that getting the weapon adopted was as important as getting the weapon designed. He spent the better part of 15 years doing it. Through the 1920s and into the early 1930s, he produced preliminary designs, refined them, produced detailed drawings, built prototypes, submitted them for Army testing, incorporated the feedback, and started again. He did much of this work in his spare time, beyond his regular duties at the Armory. He was also planning and overseeing the modernization of the Armory's production facilities, new buildings, new machinery, the transformation of the Watershops facility into what eventually became one of the most advanced metal working plants in the world. In 1926, the Army Ordnance Committee announced its formal criteria for the new infantry rifle. Garand refined his design to meet them. He produced a gas-operated semi-automatic mechanism, using a small amount of the gas generated by firing a cartridge to drive the bolt rearward, eject the spent case, and chamber the next round from the 8-round clip automatically. The result was a rifle that could fire 8 rounds as fast as the trigger could be pulled, reload quickly, and maintain the accuracy of a bolt-action weapon. The rifle was patented in Garand's name in 1934. It was officially adopted by the Army in 1932 after he ended up formally ending service in 1930 following the decision of General MacArthur, then Army staff. Production began at Springfield in 1937. It had taken 18 years from Garand's first assignment at the Bureau of Standards. 15 of those years had been spent at Springfield, in a workshop, on a civil servant's salary, producing a rifle that most of the people around him thought was either unnecessary or impossible. He was right and they were wrong. The war would prove it. The M1 Garand that entered production in 1937 was, by the standards of the time, a genuinely revolutionary infantry weapon. Understanding why requires understanding it in comparison to what the soldiers who used it had been using before, and what their enemies were using against them. The bolt-action rifles that the M1 replaced and competed against were accurate, reliable, and well-understood weapons with decades of refinement behind them. The German Mauser Kar 98K had better workmanship than the Garand. The British Lee Enfield had superior build quality, by some measures. A trained soldier with a bolt-action rifle and a smooth technique could achieve a high rate of fire, 15 aimed rounds per minute in the best conditions. But 15 rounds per minute in the best conditions is not the same as 15 rounds per minute in the worst conditions. Under stress, with cold hands, in mud, in rain, with the incoming fire making deliberate bolt operation almost impossible, the practical rate of fire of a bolt-action rifle dropped significantly. And more than with the area of heard and good operation, the down, he wrote by it fired. In the fluid, close-range fighting that characterized many of the most decisive engagements of the Second World War, that pause was a real tactical disadvantage. The M1 eliminated the pause. After each shot, the gas mechanism cycled the action automatically. The soldier needed only to aim and squeeze the trigger again. 8 rounds from a loaded Garand could be fired in approximately 20 seconds by a trained soldier, and he could reload quickly, inserting a fresh 8-round clip without taking his eyes off the target. In practical combat terms, this meant that a single American soldier with an M1 could deliver the same volume of fire as 2 or sometimes 3 soldiers armed with bolt-action rifles. The tactical implications of this advantage compounded rapidly at the unit level. A squad of 12 American soldiers with M1s could generate a volume of fire that a German squad of equivalent size could not match without a machine gun. In the ambush and counter-ambush situations that characterized fighting in the hedgerows of Normandy, in the jungles of New Guinea, in the streets of Italian cities, the M1's rate of fire was a decisive factor in dozens of engagements where the arithmetic of firepower was the difference between surviving and not. Beyond rate of fire, the M1 had other practical advantages that proved significant in the field. It was accurate to approximately 550 yards, comparable to its bolt-action competitors and sufficient for most practical infantry engagements. It weighed 9.5 pounds, heavier than some would have preferred, but manageable, and soldiers who carried it through years of combat almost universally praised its reliability. It could be field-stripped, disassembled into its major components for cleaning and maintenance in seconds, under conditions that would have made more complex maintenance impossible. General MacArthur's report from Patton in early 1942 captured the weapon's battlefield performance precisely. Under combat conditions, he wrote, it operated with no mechanical defects. When used in foxholes, it did not develop stoppages from dust or dirt. It had been in almost constant action for as much as a week without cleaning or lubrication. For a weapon expected to function in the hands of soldiers operating under extreme stress in harsh environments, that report was the most important endorsement possible. The M1 worked when it needed to. The weapon also proved adaptable. It could fire regular ball ammunition, tracer rounds, armor-piercing ammunition, and incendiary rounds. With a relatively simple attachment, it could function as a grenade launcher, a capability that significantly extended a rifle squad's tactical options without requiring additional specialized weapons to be carried. In the jungle fighting of the Pacific, the M1's 30-caliber 30-06 cartridge proved to have exceptional penetration characteristics. Before that theater of a single root of the M1 pad of multi-emi soldier the vile, a tab really had no equivalent to the IRCO of it carried out of the forces. In the close quarters, vegetation-choked terrain of the Pacific Islands, where opposing forces sometimes literally collided on narrow jungle paths, this penetration capability was not a theoretical advantage. It was immediate and decisive. The Germans and Japanese both studied the M1 and understood what it meant. The German response was to accelerate development of their own semi-automatic designs. The Gewehr 43 reached production in 1943, providing German infantry with comparable capability. But the Gewehr 43 never achieved the reliability or the scale of production of the M1. It was issued in limited numbers and never became the standard German infantry weapon. The Japanese developed a semi-automatic prototype, but never moved it to production. The tactical disparity in individual infantry firepower between American soldiers with M1s and their opponents with bolt-action rifles persisted throughout most of the war. The M1 Garand's impact on the Second World War was not just a function of its design. It was a function of how many of them could be built and how fast. And here the story moves from the workshop of a single inventor to the industrial mobilization of an entire nation. Production of the M1 began at Springfield Armory in 1937. The first proof-fired, function-tested production model came off the line on July 17th of that year, but production was slow. By the time the United States entered the war in December 1941, M1 rifles were still in short supply. Most Army and Marine Corps units were still equipped with the old Springfield M1903. The weapon had an normally that I had earlier was not available and leaded to women that were available. What followed was one of the most remarkable examples of industrial mobilization in American history. The Springfield Armory shifted to maximum production. Winchester Repeating Arms Company in New Haven, Connecticut, one of the most experienced firearms manufacturers in the country, had already been awarded a contract in 1939 and was delivering M1s by 1941. Additional contractors were brought in as the scale of the need became clear. International Harvester, better known for farm equipment than military rifles, produced M1s during the Korean War period. Harrington and Richardson Arms Company contributed further production. The Italian firm of Beretta eventually produced 100,000 M1s using Winchester tooling under licensing arrangements. At Springfield Armory, the transformation of the workforce was as significant as the transformation of the production line. Up to 70% of the armory's labor force during peak production was female. The WOWs, women ordnance workers, who had come to the armory in large numbers as the male workforce was absorbed into the military. They were producing the weapon that their husbands, fathers, sons, brothers, and partners were carrying into combat. The connection between the production floor and the battlefield was not abstract for them. It was personal. The armory also employed a significant number of African-American workers, a detail worth noting because it places the production of the M1 in the broader social context of wartime America, where the industrial mobilization was drawing on the full range of the country's workforce in ways that peacetime employment practices had not permitted. By the end of the war in 1945, the Springfield Armory alone had produced 4.5 million M1 rifles. The three major contractors had produced another million. 5.5 million rifles in total, enough to arm every soldier and Marine the United States put into the field, with reserves for training, for attrition, for the rapid expansion of forces that the war required. That production achievement was only possible because of the decisions Garand had made 15 years earlier about how the rifle should be designed. His brown and sharp training, the integration of design with production machinery, the discipline of designing for manufacturability at scale, was embedded in the M1's design from the beginning. The rifle's components were designed to be produced by machine tools and assembled by workers who could be trained quickly, not by skilled armorers working at a craftsman's pace. When the production lines at Springfield and Winchester scaled up, they scaled up smoothly because the rifle had been designed to permit it. This is the part of the Garand story that is easy to overlook when a focus is on the weapon's battlefield performance. The M1's greatest strategic contribution was not the rate of fire it gave individual soldiers. It was a great weapon that cannot be produced at scale is not a great weapon for a great war. The M1 Garand was both. The M1 Garand went to war in every environment the Second World War created, and the range of those environments was extraordinary. This was not a weapon that had been optimized for one type of terrain or one type of climate. It was a weapon that had been designed to function under virtually any conditions, and the war tested that design against conditions that no testing program could fully have anticipated. In Tunisia and Morocco in 1942 and 1943, M1s operated in the desert wastes where fine sand penetrated every mechanical system that was not specifically sealed against it. The sand that fouled bolt action mechanisms and jammed actions on other weapons did not stop the Garand. MacArthur's report from Baton, no mechanical defects, no stoppages from dust or dirt, proved to be predictive of performance across multiple desert environments. In Italy through 1943, 1944, and into 1945, M1s operated in the winter mud of the Apennines, in the rubble of Monte Cassino, in the flooded lowlands of the Po Valley. The Italian campaign was fought in some of the most tactically difficult terrain in the European theater, where the combination of mountainous ground and determined German defense forced infantry to fight at close range in conditions where the M1's rate of fire was repeatedly decisive in small unit engagements. In the Pacific, the environments were as varied as the islands themselves. The fog-shrouded Aleutian Islands in Alaska, the steaming swamps and jungles of Guadalcanal and New Guinea, the baked coral of Tarawa and Okinawa, the humidity, the mud, the salt air, the temperature extremes, all of them are hostile to metal and wood construction in ways that require a weapon to be genuinely robust rather than merely durable under controlled testing conditions. The M1 performed in all of them. In the Pacific fighting particularly, the tactical situation that the M1's designers had implicitly anticipated close of into and the enemy whose stuff emphasized the aggressive offensive act and inevitably closed with defending forces played out deeply in ways that gave the Garand's rate of fire maximum tactical value. The account that appears in the historical record of a single Marine dropping 8 Japanese soldiers charging with fixed bayonets before they reached his position is not a legend. It is a description of a tactical reality that the M1's capabilities made possible and that bolt-action weapons could not have produced. In France and Belgium and the Netherlands and Germany itself, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes to the rubble of the German cities, the M1 was present in every engagement. The Ardennes campaign of the winter of 1944 to 1945 subjected weapons to temperatures that froze lubricants and made metal brittle. The M1 functioned through conditions that caused more mechanically complex weapons to fail. The British Army evaluated the M1 Garand as a potential replacement for its Lee Enfield and ultimately declined to adopt it. The evaluation involved simulated combat testing under various conditions, and the Lee Enfield performed well enough relative to the M1's characteristics that the British concluded the disruption of replacing their standard weapon was not justified by the performance advantage. This was a reasonable military decision given the specific circumstances of British procurement and logistics in mid-war. It did not change the fact that American infantry using the M1 had a firepower advantage over German infantry using the Mossad that was visible and consequential in engagement after engagement. The German Gewehr 43 semi-automatic rifle, when it appeared in 1943, demonstrated that German engineers had recognized the tactical significance of the M1 and were attempting to match it. The Gewehr 43 was a capable weapon. It was also produced in much smaller quantities than the M1, was less reliable under harsh field conditions, and arrived too late to change the calculus of a war whose outcome was already being shaped by a firepower advantage that American infantry had been building since 1941. By 1945, the M1 Garand had fought on 6 continents and in every climate the Earth produces. It had been carried by the men who stormed the beaches of Normandy, by the Marines who raised the flag on Suribachi, by the soldiers who crossed the Rhine, by the troops who liberated the concentration camps. It had been present at every defining moment of American arms in the Second World War. Patton's assessment, the greatest battle implement ever devised, was not hyperbole from a general prone to dramatic statements. It was the verdict of a commander who had his soldiers use this weapon for 3 years at a continuous combat across 2 continents and had seen what it could do when the arithmetic of war came down to how fast a soldier could fire and how reliably his weapon would function when his life depended on it. I want to stop the operational history for a moment, because there is a story running parallel to the story of the M1 Garand's battlefield performance that is less dramatic and more important, and that gets far less attention than the weapon itself. John Cantius Garand spent 15 years designing the rifle that armed 5.5 million American soldiers and Marines. He spent another 15 years at the Springfield Armory after the war ended, working as a consultant on further development projects. He retired in 1953. He died in Springfield, Massachusetts, on February 16, 1974, at the age of 86. He received no royalties from the production of the M1 Garand. Not a cent. Not from the 5.5 million rifles produced during the war. Not from the additional production during the Korean War. Not from the NATO countries that adopted the weapon after 1948. Not from the Beretta production in Italy. He had accepted civil service status when he joined the Springfield Armory in 1920, which meant his inventions belonged to the government. He had freely assigned all of his patents to the United States government. His annual salary was a civil servant's salary, modest, secure, and entirely unrelated to the commercial value of what he had created. The commercial value of what he had created was, to state the obvious, substantial. The M1 Garand was produced in quantities and under contracts that represented hundreds of millions of dollars in wartime procurement. The individual firearms companies that manufactured it under contract, Winchester, International Harvester, Harrington, and Richardson, made money on those contracts. John Garand, who had designed the weapon and spent 15 years developing the manufacturing processes that made production at scale possible, did not. This was not a secret. It was known and acknowledged throughout the war and afterward. The medals he received, the Medal for Meritorious Service in 1941 and the Medal for Merit in 1944, were genuine recognitions of genuine contribution. General Patton's letter to the Ordnance Department was a genuine tribute from a commander who understood what the weapon had done for his soldiers. The public acknowledgement of Garand's contribution was real. But acknowledgement and compensation are different things. A bill was introduced in Congress to award Garand $100,000 in recognition of his work, a sum that represented a fraction of the value his invention had created and a fraction of what private inventors in comparable situations had received. The bill failed to pass. There are several ways to think about this. The civil service framework that governed Garand's employment was clear, and he had accepted it knowingly when he chose to become a government employee. The principle that inventions made in the course of government employment belong to the government is legally established and administratively consistent. The government needed the best designers it could find for its weapons programs, and compensating them on the same terms as private inventors would have created a different set of incentive structures with their own complications. All of that is true, and it does not change the fact that the man who designed the most important individual weapon of the largest war in human history received a civil service pension in 2 medals while the companies that manufactured his design made substantial profits from it. Garand himself appears to have accepted this situation without bitterness, at least in his public statements. He remained at the Springfield Armory as a consultant after his retirement, believing initially that some form of additional compensation would eventually come. It did not. He continued working on firearms design because it was what he did, not because he expected to profit from it. He died in 1974 in the city where he had spent his working life. The rifle that bore his name was by then 20 years out of service in the United States Army, having been replaced by the M14 in 1957, but it was still in use by the Marine Corps Silent Drill Team, still in use by National Guard units, still in use by military services in more than a dozen countries, still collected, shot, and admired by firearms enthusiasts who recognized in it the work of a man who had solved a hard problem with uncommon skill and uncommon patience. The gravestone in Springfield does not mention the rifle. It does not need to. The rifle is the memorial. The M1 Garand went out of official United States Army service in 1957, replaced by the M14, a rifle that was itself eventually replaced by the M16, which was lighter, fully automatic, and chambered for a smaller cartridge. The evolution of infantry weapons continued, as it always does, driven by changes in tactical doctrine, advances in materials science, and the lessons of new conflicts. The M1's specific combination of characteristics, the 8-round end-block clip, the 30 caliber cartridge, the 9.5-pound weight, belonged to a particular moment in the development of infantry tactics and military technology. By the 1950s, the tactical environment was changing in ways that made different trade-offs appropriate. The M14 offered a 20-round detachable magazine and selective fire capability. The M16 offered a much lighter weapon with a higher cyclic rate. The M1 was not the final answer to the question of what an infantry rifle should be. No single weapon is ever the final answer to that question. The history of military firearms is a continuous dialogue between what the current threat requires and what the current technology can produce, with each generation of weapons representing a specific solution to a specific problem that was itself a response to the solution that came before it. What the M1 Garand was is the weapon that established, conclusively and with the evidence of the largest war in human history, that semi-automatic fire was the appropriate standard for infantry rifles. Every military service in the world that equips its infantry with rifles today equips them with semi-automatic or fully automatic weapons. The bolt-action standard that the M1 replaced has not returned, and will not return, to military service. John Garand was right about what infantry needed, and he was right 15 years before anyone else was willing to act on the conclusion. The specific design decisions embedded in the M1, the gas-operated mechanism, the rotating bolt, the emphasis on reliability over refinement, the design for mass producibility, were not simply solutions to the problem of 1944. They were templates. The gas-operated rotating bolt design that Garand developed is the basis of the operating mechanism of most military rifles produced since the Second World War, including the M16 and its derivatives that have been the American standard infantry weapon for 60 years. The specific implementation has been refined, the caliber changed, the materials updated. The underlying principle is Garand's. The M1 also matters as a case study in what military innovation actually requires. Not just a good idea, not just a capable designer. The Garand had all of those things, but he had to fight for all of them over 15 years. The rifle that entered service in 1936 was the product of 15 years of institutional friction as much as 15 years of engineering. That lesson, that revolutionary military technology requires not just invention but patient institutional advocacy over extended time, is as applicable today as it was in 1934 when the M1 was patented. The institutions that procure military weapons are conservative by inclination and by rational calculation. New weapons are unproven. Changing the standard weapon of a military force is disruptive and expensive. The incentive to stay with what is known is always strong. Overcoming that incentive requires the combination of a demonstrably superior design and someone willing to keep demonstrating its superiority until the institution runs out of reasons to say no. Garand was that person. He had the design and the patience in equal measure. The 15 years in the workshop at Springfield were not wasted years. They were the years that built the foundation for 5.5 million rifles that armed the soldiers who fought the most important war of the 20th century. There is a line that appears near the end of most accounts of the M1 Garand, quoted from veterans and collectors who have handled and used the weapon across the decades since the war. It is a simple line. As one World War II infantry sergeant told his son, "That is a man's gun." The line is not a technical assessment. It is not a ballistics comparison or a reliability specification. It is a human judgment about a relationship between a soldier and the weapon he carries into the most dangerous situations a human being can enter. It speaks to the Garand's weight and solidity, to the way it handles and feels, to the confidence that comes from carrying a weapon that has proved itself in the worst conditions imaginable and come through them functioning. John Garand never went to war. He spent the years when his rifle was being carried by 5 million soldiers in a workshop in Springfield, Massachusetts, continuing to work on the weapons design problems that the government needed solved next. He did not see the hedgerows of Normandy or the beaches of Iwo Jima or the streets of Aachen. He did make a distinctive ping of an M1 clip ejecting, a sound that became so associated with American infantry in combat that some veterans who reported Japanese soldiers were sometimes scared and of their attacks at knowing the American weapon was momentarily empty, not understanding that the Americans' hands were already inserting a full clip on the weapon and would fire again before the Japanese soldier could close the distance. What Garand knew was the workshop, the model shop where he spent his days in September 1940, focused on the next design problem, intent on the next refinement, the precision machining problems, the production engineering problems, the gap between what was theoretically possible and what could be practically manufactured at scale in a factory staffed by workers who had been trained in weeks rather than years. These were not glamorous problems. They did not generate photographs or citations or the kind of recognition that attaches to the men who carry weapons into battle. But they were the problems whose solutions they the battle implement that Patton priest that MacArthur reported on from Baton, that 5 million soldiers carried through years of global war and almost never complained about except for the weight. The M1 Garand remains in service today in ceremonial roles, the Marine Corps Silent Drill Team, the Norwegian Royal Guards Drill Team, the ROC units at universities across the country. It remains prized by collectors who recognize in its design and manufacture the work of a craftsman operating at the highest level of his discipline. It remains shot at ranges by enthusiasts who find in its handling and accuracy a connection to the mid-20th century standard of what a rifle should be. And it remains the answer to a question that a 12-year-old boy sweeping floors in a Connecticut textile mill had not yet thought to ask. What happens when you give every infantry soldier a weapon that fires 3 times faster than the other side's? What happens to the arithmetic of the firefight? What happens to the squad that had 8 men and now, effectively, has 24? The answer played out across the beaches and jungles and hedgerows and city streets of the Second World War. It played out in a gap between the German squad's rate of fire and the American squad's rate of fire. It played out in the reports from commanders who had used both kinds of weapons and understood what the difference meant. It played out in the 5.5 million rifles that came off the production lines at Springfield and Winchester and were shipped to every theater of the war. John Candy is scared and got a civil service pension. He got 2 medals. He got a modest salary for 34 years of work that produced one of the most consequential infantry weapons in the history of warfare. He got the quiet satisfaction, one assumes, of knowing that what he had built worked, that the design he had refined through 15 years of institutional friction and workshop discipline had performed exactly as he had believed it would, under conditions that would have broken less carefully considered weapons. He did not get the $100,000. He did not get the royalties. He did not get the recognition, in his lifetime, that matched the scale of what he had contributed. He died in 1974, in the city where he had worked, in a quiet aftermath of a career that had changed the way a war was fought. That rifle is still out there, in collections, in museums, on parade grounds, at ranges. The wooden stock and the blued steel of a weapon built to last because it was designed by a man who understood that in war, the things that keep you alive have to keep working. Every time the old disciples, every time the land is operated exactly as Garand decided to operate, there's a small, the handful argument that they made, that 15 years no workshop was worth it, that the civil service salary was not weighted, that, well, the old boy left school to so each floors and taught himself everything else was right about land infantry revelation. In my opinion, the M1 rifle is the greatest battle implement ever devised. General George S. Patton, January 26, 1945. John Garand received no royalties. He never complained about it.